welcome to this lunchtime New York time webinar here over Zoom and YouTube, a virtual event that's sponsored by the Harriman Institute at Columbia University and Eurasianet, Conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, Regional and Domestic Dimensions. We are delighted and privileged to be joined by two really prominent members of our communities. The first is Josh Kucera, who is a leading correspondent of Eurasianet. He's been covering the conflict, including the dramatic developments over the last 24 hours, and he is joining us from Yerevan. So thank you, Josh, for going out of your way to be with us today. And then Professor Julie George is our faculty expert on the Caucasus, also a professor of political science at Queens College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And welcome to you both. Before we start, I want to invite my colleague, Justin Burke, who is the publisher of Eurasianet and executive director, for a couple of comments. You're on mute, Justin.
Thank you, Alex. We're very happy to be co-hosting this event. Karabakh has always presented a particular challenge for coverage for us, and you have to have a very thick skin in covering this. No matter, we've always tried to present a complete picture of what's going on, and in doing that, it opens us up for verbal brickbats being tossed by people from all sides. But when we get criticism like that, and especially criticism from both sides, we feel that maybe we're not hitting the mark. So, we're happy today to have two experts on this issue who can present a 360-degree view of everything. And I'm hoping we can learn about what's happened already, but also what's coming next. So I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Justin. And just a few words about the format today. We will go for approximately an hour until the top of the hour. The format is I will engage the speakers in a series of questions, and then with about 25 minutes or so left, we'll open it up to audience questions. We are going to ask that you identify yourself in the chat if you're asking a question. No anonymous questions. Any disrespectful question will be ignored and dismissed. And we really are here for an informed discussion, not for advocacy appeals. So I just want to lay those out as ground rules. So let's kick things off. Josh, you are in the region. You have been at the center of reporting a lot of these dramatic events. It seems as if we have a settlement. What can you tell us about the contours of the settlement and the situation on the ground that led up to the events of the last 24 hours? Thanks again.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, so it's been a big 24 hours. In the middle of the night last night, local time, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev, and Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a tripartite agreement ending the war. The war had been going on for about a month and a half. The peace agreement was signed a couple of days after the key town of Shusha in Nagorno-Karabakh was taken by Azerbaijani forces. That appeared to have been the turning point of the war that convinced Armenia that they needed to come to the table. The terms of the agreement are extremely favorable for Azerbaijan. They get control of basically all of the land that they have conquered during this war, plus all of the rest of the 7 territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh that they have been seeking to get back for more than 25 years after losing these territories in the first war. So yeah, this war began a month and a half ago, as everybody knows by now. Azerbaijan started this offensive with heavy Turkish backing. to retake these territories. This is kind of the thing that we've been expecting for years in this region. Anybody following the conflict has been expecting this. The Turkish involvement was a bit of a surprise. That's been sort of the wild card here, that nobody really expected this very strong Turkish support for Azerbaijan. It does appear that the Turkish military support was effective. I don't know if it was decisive militarily, but Turkey provided these new drones, and more than that, provided apparently some innovative tactics in using these drones along with the other equipment that made this war far, far more successful for Azerbaijan than really anybody had expected coming in. So the war was a really extreme military success for Azerbaijan, and that's now resulted in this very strong political success for them. So yeah, the deal also includes a really key element of the deal is that Russian peacekeepers will be enforcing the deal. They've already arrived in Karabakh. They started arriving just a matter of a few hours after it was signed. 2,000 Russian peacekeepers eventually. I don't know if all 2,000 are there now. This is a big deal. This is something that Azerbaijan, for example, has extremely strongly rejected throughout the entire negotiating process. Armenia was never super thrilled about it either, but this was always sort of a red line for Azerbaijan. So it's interesting that they accepted that. What else? The other really kind of surprise element of this deal is that Azerbaijan will get some kind of corridor, and the connecting the quote unquote mainland of Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan, their exclave, which is not connected to the rest of Azerbaijan. It doesn't, from the wording of the agreement, it's not clear whether this is some kind of territory that Armenia is going to hand over. It sounds more like it's some sort of agreement where Armenia and Russia will guarantee the security of Azerbaijani transport between those two things, which is going to be an enormously complicated issue, but that seems like it's kind of for the future. What's very immediate is that Armenian forces have to withdraw from these occupied territories really extremely quickly, like within the next month. Armenian forces are supposed to be gone from all of these territories. So yeah, it's really quite a dramatic development. So I'll leave it at that.
Josh, thanks for that. Maybe if I could ask you one follow-up regarding Russia's role in the conflict as it emerged. Of course, Russia has a treaty of alliance through the CSTO with Armenia. And how did that shape its actions, and how did the Russian side interpret its obligations under that mandate versus what was being called for on the Armenian side? And then just a final kind of thought I'd like your input in. I saw someone yesterday on social media sort of make the kind of jabbing comment so much for the notion that Russia's role in its near abroad wouldn't be strengthened by this. And I think a lot of Western commentators have been caught out by the sort of strength of position this appears to put Russia in. Is that your take too? So maybe just a little bit more on the whole Russian dimension here as we.
Yeah, the Russian dimension. I mean, it's very hard to understand, and it's the issue of a lot of speculation. And when you're on the ground, tons of rumors and speculation about what's really going on. It's very hard to figure out, and even from on the official level, it's really very difficult to know what their angle has been. In terms of, so yes, as you alluded to, Russia has a security agreement, a security guarantee with Armenia through the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Member states are obliged to protect one another in case of an invasion. I actually looked at the CSTO charter just yesterday to kind of refresh my memory, and I've already forgotten the exact wording, but it's actually quite vague, the wording. It's not even, I think, as precise as NATO's Article 5. It's quite open to interpretation. And Russia, so the thing with this conflict is that it's been taking place solely on what is internationally recognized as Azerbaijani territory, that is Karabakh and the 7 surrounding territories. So Russia has made it very clear that, just since this war started, it's made it clear that it's taking its CSTO obligations literally, and that it's going to defend Armenia proper, Armenia's international borders. And they've actually kind of demonstratively set up new posts along Armenia's borders with Azerbaijan as a sort of tripwire. At the same time, they have done, I think, nothing to fulfill what I think some Armenians hoped would be more of the spirit of the alliance, which is some kind of military help in Karabakh itself. They really have not. That's a matter of a lot of speculation, whether it's due to a kind of general retrenchment or a kind of Russian foreign policy becoming more modest over the last few years, whether it's a desire to punish Pashinyan, who they've never been particularly fond of, or if not to punish, if just to not particularly go out of their way to do anything to defend him. And then to get up, so their role in this has been, a little bit difficult to figure out, I would say. But the social media comment you alluded to earlier is absolutely right. Their position has been strengthened unequivocally. In Azerbaijan, this is already the matter of a bit of contention that Azerbaijan was very proud of its independence and its lack of need to depend on a big power. And now they have Russian peacekeepers enforcing this deal on their territory. That is something that a lot of Azerbaijanis have already expressed irritation with. And for Armenia too, this is, there was a hope, I think, amongst a certain type of Armenian that the so-called Velvet Revolution of 2018, when Nikol Pashinyan came to power, this would lead to a kind of more closer ties with the West and kind of a moving away from Russia. And there were definitely hopes, I would say, in places like Washington and Brussels and Europe in general. That was always a bit overblown on both cases. Pashinyan is not a particularly pro-Western guy. He's not a particularly anti-Russian guy. I don't think geopolitics is really his thing. However, there were a lot of people in his ruling team, including in very high positions, who were literal Soros Grant people, the exact Russian bugaboo. And these people were in quite high positions. So this is something that kind of freaked Russia out and made them never particularly happy about the revolution. Whether this is what has explained their role in this, probably in part, but I would, it's difficult to say.
Great, thanks for sorting through that and trying to untangle it. Julie, let's move on to you. You're a scholar of the Caucasus, but more precisely, you're a scholar of nationalism and its impact on state building and domestic politics. And many of our audience members today will be very familiar with the conflict, but some won't. Could you speak to, in general, how the conflict impacts domestic identity formation, state building, and domestic politics in these countries?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, of course, for inviting me. It's always exciting to be part of these things, although today, of course, is a sober day, and we've watched 6 weeks of continued violence, and that's always it's always compelling, but it's always a caution, right? Because at the end of the game, the people who bear the brunt of, especially of ethnic and civil wars, are civilians, because the way that the wars proceed is through the taking of villages and urban centers, and counter-value strikes are the most politically available. It's the best political currency for combatants. So what I'd like to do is I was thinking about this and thinking about your question. I think a good way to understand where Nagorno-Karabakh and the conversations about Nagorno-Karabakh fit within a broader political and state building context for Armenia and Azerbaijan is to keep in mind that this is actually, while it appears to be a conflict about territory, it's a conflict about narrative, and it's a conflict about meaning. And what it domestically means for people, it becomes a political tool, but it also becomes a political cudgel for people in opposition. It also becomes an opportunity to remove others. So there's a divergence then between the actual meaning of the conflict and what it means for the people on the ground, and it's used inside domestic politics. It also, of course, has an effect on international politics, which Josh has talked about, and I presume we'll talk about further with discussing its relevance in Russia, Turkey, and Georgia, and for the EU and the United States as well. I think it's important to remind ourselves that this conflict started prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and for both Armenia and Azerbaijan, it was their state legitimizing framework. It was the manner in which they became independent from the Soviet Union, and they declared and enhanced the meaning of that independence. And as such, the ownership of this territory is bound into the understanding of Armenian legitimacy or Azerbaijani political legitimacy as states. So part of that political narrative for the people on the ground is the sense that without Nagorno-Karabakh, their state is lesser. It is not a full Armenia without Nagorno-Karabakh. It is not a full Azerbaijan without Nagorno-Karabakh. And not only is the notion kind of bound into the legitimacy of the political leaders of the state, it is fundamentally exclusive in this rendering of that territorial meaning. It's not the case that the territory has always had these exclusivist contours. You can go back in time and see where it has had exclusivist contours and where it hasn't had them. But at its current state, with the kind of state building legitimizing force, its role as a legitimizing force inside these independent states, it is exclusive. And so that means as long as Armenia is winning and holds a status quo, which it did until, after the 1994 ceasefire until now, really, Armenia had been winning, and it could claim that legitimizing force. And Azerbaijan was lesser, and its political leadership was lesser for not being able to realize its full essence. Of course, in the domestic narratives for Azerbaijan, and in Armenia now, right? The Pashinyan's action, the experience of the war, the knowledge that this war was coming. Josh referred to the fact that, this is something we've been expecting for a while. We just didn't know when it was going to come. The reason why we were expecting it for a while is because both of these states have been arming themselves in anticipation for this event. This arming, this anticipation, this military spending precedes Pashinyan. It precedes the Velvet Revolution. It precedes Ilham Aliyev's place as the Azeri president. And so I think it's important to, when we think about the domestic contours, is not think of these as necessarily the actions of this one particular political individual or this other political individual, because the institutional structure for action here has been happening for much longer than any one individual's tenure. What we do know politically from these domestic narratives, though, is that that those who succeed here are rewarded. So Robert Kocharyan, Serge Sargsyan, Levante Petrosyan, all kind of heroes, lions of the Nagorno-Karabakh military effort in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, became the first three presidents of Armenia. Nikol Pashinyan is the first who is not in this group, this kind of this veteran effort to become a chief executive in Armenia. Another important component to this, of course, is that Ter Petrosyan he had to resign. He was pushed out of power once he articulated an agreement with some concessions to Azerbaijan over the status, which kind of made politically salient this exclusivist domestic narrative and put a lot of pressure and provided opportunities, really, for his opposition to take power. This was the mechanism by which Robert Kocharyan became president of Armenia. And so now that domestic narrative turns into a political opportunity, or maybe even not a political opportunity, that might be too cynical, right? Because of course, that action speaks to a very important constituency in this state building narrative. The lesson in Azerbaijan has been even harsher, right? And that is that the first two presidents of Azerbaijan were removed from power as a result of their failures on the front in Nagorno-Karabakh. And so Aliyev now is looking at this opportunity, but also, of course, this risk. And the early commentary, especially from the Armenian side in social media in assessing the war, was really much focused on the risk that Aliyev was taking, hoping to say, okay, there's a weakness, there's a vulnerability, there's something here that we could yet win, right? And that was part of that narrative of that side. Now, with this ceasefire, of course, it's early yet. We're going to see where the political bodies fall. It's obviously a win for Aliyev. It's also obviously a failure for Pashinyan already. Protesters have looted his office, and there are opposition actors calling for his resignation. But if we step back, right, from that political messaging, and even from that domestic narrative of exclusivity, I wonder what has been gained here, right? I mean, there is this territory, and it's so important in meaning, but these are two countries who struggle with economic development. Azerbaijan is in the middle of a massive recession born of the coronavirus and the lowering, the failure of the falling gas and oil prices. I'm not saying that that's a reason. I don't think necessarily it's a reason for this action, but there's a bigger structural problem for Azerbaijan to overcome that the restoration of Nagorno-Karabakh is only going to complicate. It's not going to resolve it. There are IDPs that need to be put back and rehomed on the Azerbaijani side, and this is a society that has this massive inequality gap between the economic haves in Baku and the have-nots in everywhere else. And for every reason, I mean, we have no reason to think that Nagorno-Karabakh is going to be any different than that everywhere else. So that's number one. Number two, for the Armenians who are there, they are reasonably quite terrified. The temptation for ethnic cleansing is robust here. We can only hope that the Russians will be able to stop that from happening, but you are going to see a dilution of the Armenian community in Nagorno-Karabakh. Many will flee. Many may face repression depending on how the ceasefire is held. And I think it's important for us to recognize the vulnerability and the human cost that this resolution is going to come with. It comes at a great transformation, of course, for the Armenian experience, especially those who are in those areas. And finally, and this is probably the most controversial thing I'll say so far, is that for Armenia, stepping away again from this exclusivist position, this opens up a lot of developmental opportunities. I mean, Nagorno-Karabakh has always been expensive to maintain diplomatically, politically, and economically. And this could be an opportunity. I mean, it comes with a bitter taste, but there is the cost of maintaining it have been high, both at the economic and to the expense of political independence by anyone who sits in the role of the chief executive. And this may free up some opportunity for them to act.
Certainly a lot of possible inflection points here to ponder. Josh, we go back to you. We mentioned already some comments about social media, how intense they have been. I wonder, from your perspective, what role has social media played in these competing frames and in the coverage of the war? Has this been part of the quote unquote battle? And in general, I think our audience would be really interesting to talk a little bit about your experiences as a journalist covering the war, what has been unexpected, and what can you tell us about, covering contemporary conflict in the year 2020 for Eurasianet and others?
Well, yeah, I mean, social media really, it does play a huge role, I would say, in this, in the media coverage, and in a number of different ways. And I hope I can keep these all straight. I mean, one is, as you said, there's a huge amount of misinformation being put out. This is my first war it's been a long time in the social media age. And it's been really striking the vast amount of misinformation there is and the degree to which the respective sides believe their own side's disinformation. And so my Twitter feed has turned into like two separate realities. I mean, very different realities, where the Armenian MOD says something, this was all in the past tense, said something, and absolutely every, the most critical, Armenians, oh yes, this is what's going on. Likewise with the Azerbaijanis, and so it was very. You had this sort of battle going on with social media, with very diverging narratives. Then what was an interesting development, I would say, I don't know, maybe this started to happen a week or so after the war. All these people on Caucasus social media, we're not really capable of deciphering what a drone video means. But then they're kind of entered into this conversation. Some of them are, military experts at institutes or universities and so on, but some of them are kind of social media hobbyists, just guys, and they're all our guys who know how to read these things, and they read the open source material and they put this stuff out. And it's really been quite remarkable and quite useful for journalists to sort through the mass of disinformation that's been going on. And so I would say in the first few days, weeks of the war, we didn't have any idea what was happening. And then these people came and started doing their own maps based on geolocation and following the various, and we could see that in fact Azerbaijan was making a lot of progress. I mean, everyone's always rightly skeptical of Azerbaijani government's public proclamations, but in this case it turned out that they were more or less correct. Another thing that you alluded to is the sort of hate that you get on this, and that's something that at Eurasianet we're long used to, and it sort of falls off of you, and it's not such a big deal. What was kind of surprising to me about this, so we've been covering this for a while, of course, but now it's the world's kind of big media who are covering it, and they don't really know what is going on, and so it's a huge minefield for them to get into. And I talked to, I shouldn't say the publication, but a very big publication. Their correspondent said that their editors were very worried about being balanced. They were like, please, you have to do everything you can to be balanced, because they were really afraid of this vitriol that they were getting. And you saw in one case, this was a very notorious case among Azerbaijanis, but there was a French TV report that Armenians in France objected very strongly to, and the French TV network took it off their website. They sort of unpublished it. And so I've been a little bit surprised the degree to which big media that I wouldn't think would be afraid of these sort of social media brickbats have been, I think, to some degree intimidated by the level of the sort of ferocity of the response from people involved in the conflict. So yeah, that's I would say the kind of the social media angle for us. I don't know what there is to say about how we've been covering the war. It's remarkable that it's noteworthy that I personally was denied a visa to Azerbaijan. I was denied a visa to Nagorno-Karabakh. As far as I can tell, both in sort of as a result of my previous reporting in these places. Azerbaijan, obviously, everyone knows, is an extremely difficult journalistic environment, one of the least free press environments in the world. And from what I've been told, it's gotten even worse from people who are there and trying to cover things. The restrictions are even greater than they have been. They're also much greater here in Armenia. We are restricted in Armenia from where we can go geographically. There's 3 whole provinces we are banned from entering. For local media, there's a martial law in effect that one of the provisions is that you cannot criticize the military capabilities of the armed forces of Armenia. Call into question, that's how it was phrased. So there's really quite a strong control of the media here as well. On top of, I would say, an enormous self-censorship in the media on both sides. And so that makes it quite difficult to kind of sort through local media and figure out what's going on. I mean, I've found actually local media to be, I almost don't even read local websites anymore. All you can really rely on is sort of official proclamations. So yeah, there's a lot of information complications in covering the war.
Great. And Julie, maybe just same to you. What are your thoughts observing this from outside in terms of the role of social media in shaping these narratives. And I'm also wondering about your thoughts on what's been the role of the Armenian diaspora in the construction of some of these narratives, and how do they figure into the domestic situation in Armenia?
Well, to me, as Josh was saying, it's really hard to navigate truth from fiction, and I kind of approach it in terms of narrative and discourse, because there you don't really, it doesn't matter what's true or not true, right? To many on the Armenian side, the truth is Nagorno-Karabakh is theirs, and to many on the Azeri side, the truth is Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, and so they look at chinks in a kind of legitimizing armor to show the righteousness of this claim. And I think that's what most of the rhetoric is about. It's about staking a claim and trying to get allies to come forward, to lead them into a path where they find themselves legitimizing one or the other narrative. And as Josh pointed out, like, there's no way to have both sides reflected here, because that narrative is zero sum. It's an exclusivist narrative. And so that binds anybody commenting on it as kind of a series of, a trap comes to mind, purity pledges come to mind, ways to, frame things, just the very use of particular words. Like, I've been using Nagorno-Karabakh. I haven't used the word Artsakh, but the moment I say it, then that is a legitimizing frame. I say Shusha, not Shushi, or I say Shushi and not Shusha. That too is indicative of some kind of meaning. Now, the meaning may not be mine, it might not be my meaning, but it will be understood by someone else's narrative as part of the meaning. I think most of the things that you find in social media that aren't official statements, or even if they are official statements, follow those kind of narrative structures, and should be seen inside that larger framework. As an academic, I'm not a journalist. I get I'm lucky to be able to take the analytical, longer view. But I think it is a bit disruptive to find ourselves locked into those narratives, because it ignores the human cost, because the human cost is shared and it is not exclusive. It is inclusive. It includes Armenian civilians and it includes Azeri civilians. And as such, that is, I think, the arena of inclusion that we can find, is the toll taken on families, the fact that when people return, they're going to find their homes destroyed, right? How are they going to build after that? Or for those Armenians who have to face the choice of staying or leaving, and what that would mean for them, and what it would mean for their families. I mean, that kind of, that to me is the larger question, and I can see it coming up, bouncing into this Q&A, this consideration, and that to me is the more inclusive thing. For the diaspora, I think that what makes a diaspora is the meaning of their diasporic condition. And for a lot of Armenian diaspora in the West and throughout Europe and in the Middle East, that condition is the experience of the genocide, and the experience of that vulnerability and that privation, and that devastation, right? And that's what forced them to flee. The creation of an Armenian state for this community cannot be understated in its importance, and the protectiveness of that they feel for it, of course, is profound. I mean, any trip to Yerevan, you'll see diasporic creations. They build the roads, they build the opera house, they donate art. They are really, they donate the airport. They're the lifeblood, really, for a lot of the Armenian economy. And a lot of that has to do with the depth of their feeling. Of course, the depth of their feeling interacts with this condition of Karabakh for them, in the sense that part of their narrative is this narrative of ownership. Part of their narrative of suffering and vulnerability comes from that experience of the genocide. And as such, it becomes parallel. It's already parallel in the narratives in Armenia, but I think for the diaspora, it's even more so. It's even more keenly felt, and that means that the desire to resist, the expression of the protection of perceived human rights violations, or even the maybe rationalization of Azerbaijani and civilian casualties kind of falls within that narrative. And I think that makes concessions much harder. And to the extent that the diaspora is really part of the Armenian political conversation, it puts Pashinyan in an even bigger kind of mire with that other international actor.
Great, thanks so much. So let's move on to questions. So first question, I'm seeing this from a number of people, and I'll just call them out, from Gerard Toel, who's no stranger to the issues of Karabakh, has run several super interesting surveys on the region and covered the conflict extensively. One of his questions is, any sense of what the status of the rump NKR will be? Rebecca Foley also asked this in the sense of, leaving Shusha as Azerbaijan, Stepanakert as Armenia. How can this hold given the geography? And how can Armenia deal with Nagorno-Karabakh now as an exclave in Azerbaijan? So, Josh, I don't know if you've given much thought to the kind of new conditions of political geography and sustainability of this deal, but I'm wondering, what's the buzz there regarding the viability of NK as an autonomous polity?
I mean, that's the big kind of lacuna in that peace agreement that was signed. There's nothing said about Stepanakert, about the Nagorno-Karabakh territories that are not taken over already by Azerbaijan, and so nobody knows. I think that in terms of security, I mean, there's going to be Russian peacekeepers, which will presumably, stop any kind of clashes. As the people have mentioned, I mean, Stepanakert and Shusha are very close to one another, and during the first war, Azerbaijani forces from Stepanakert and Shusha rather is much higher than Stepanakert, and you look down and it's very easy to shoot down there. I mean, you can see Stepanakert from Shusha, and so as long as you have the Russian peacekeepers there, it's not really an issue. But certainly long term, and I don't know what long term we're talking about here. I saw that also in the questions. I mean, I guess Rebecca mentions that this is a 5-year term for the Russian peacekeepers, but then it's like also an automatic 5 years after that, if I remember right. And then, it's talking in 50 years, this is, it's very difficult to know at this point. I mean, I think, yeah, certainly from a physical geography standpoint, political geography standpoint, it will be difficult for Armenians to kind of physically defend the borders that they have now. But I also think that the Russian peacekeepers will be obligated to stay there until there is this status worked out, and until there is a formal peace agreement and the two sides don't have any territorial claims against the other. And so, I mean, that's, who knows? We're in such early days that it's very hard to say much about that. But it is, of course, the critical question. And I've actually been thinking about Gerard's research in this, and he wrote a paper that I look at very often about the kind of the shapes of these maps and how, and the kind of importance they have in the national imagination of both sides. And I've been seeing, I entered Armenia when they'd already lost a significant amount of territory, and you just see these maps that are absolutely everywhere, where they have Armenia and Karabakh and the occupied territories all together as a unified whole, almost undifferentiated. And I mean, I stopped at a rest stop on the highway, and a massive metal map on the wall of this silhouette, and all that's going to change now. I mean, these are ubiquitous in Armenia, and that is no longer the silhouette of Armenian territory. So it's a big, to get to what Julie was saying earlier, it's a very big part of the national identity, this territory that's now going to have to be kind of reassessed.
Interesting. Julie, I want to move on to a question from Professor Jan Zachlinsky from Bern University. He asks about the role of IDPs, and especially bearing in mind that we've had IDP communities that have been given temporary refugee status for the last few decades. How should we think about this issue in terms of state building and future domestic politics? I think you've alluded to this somewhat in your comments here, but the sheer numbers here, I think, also makes it especially important.
Yes, it's hard to know, and again, it's hard. I'm having a hard time visualizing it, frankly, because the ceasefire agreement is so vague. It talks about a return, but to have a meaningful return, you have to have specifics and you have to have clarifications. Now, I'm mindful of the last resurgence of violence, or the big resurgence of violence in 2016, which was also a Russian brokered ceasefire. And within that came a promise for some repatriation of Azeri IDPs, and that never came to fruition. So one presumes that Azerbaijan, being a partner with Russia here, having chafed from that experience, has a much more concrete understanding of what that would look like. But we are not privy to that. I kind of want to answer the question that you gave to Josh earlier. I was thinking as you guys were answering this question and thinking about what it meant to have this quasi shared status with peacekeepers, Russian peacekeepers. The only one that I could think about as a precedent for us to even draw from, because this is how we draw analytically from looking at what has happened before and to apply it to our current condition, and it's hard to think of examples, is the war in South Ossetia in Georgia, where there was a status quo, a shared status quo, administrative status quo, overarched by Russian peacekeepers that lasted from through the 1990s into the outbreak of violence in 2008, with a kind of resolution to the war in Russia's favor in terms of like just pragmatically. And I wonder if the kind of stalemate that we're seeing now, I mean, it's obvious to me at least, and probably to you all as well, that the reason why this peace comes now, it's because that the Azerbaijani army took Shusha, and because of its strategic location above Stepanakert. What this actually means for the return of IDPs, though, right, is if the status is divided, that anyone, especially Armenians, are taking a risk to stay, or they're taking a risk. Yeah, they're taking a risk to stay. So the incentive will be to leave, I imagine, depending on how the ceasefire goes forward. But that's not what is intended here. But I think it's a hidden meaning that may kind of come out as time goes on, as IDPs, presumably, I mean, these are Azerbaijani IDPs, get moved in. There are so many that this might, this will upset any kind of political balance. There's nothing in the ceasefire about political governance here, about administration, about who's going to pay for the roads. I mean, there's so many different things and components about governance here that we cannot identify and isolate. So it's hard to know where the citizenry are here, which means that any answer for the status of IDPs is just as unstable because we don't know about governance.
Thanks. Josh, you are in Yerevan now. You're looking at Armenian coverage of this. There's a number of questions in the chat about Pashinyan's viability in terms of continuing to govern. He mentioned yesterday this is the most painful decisions he's ever had to make, but it was necessary. How do you see this? I mean, it's all speculation, but is this going to be a mortal blow to him? That's one. And then there's another question in here. This will go from Russell Gayushev, which gets at how do Armenians feel toward Russia and Putin now? And have any signs of anti-Russian or anti-Putin chants? Is this something that could be used as a kind of domestic political tool, sort of going forward by some of Pashinyan's opponents? So from where you sit, how's Pashinyan's grip on power looking?
Pretty shaky. I don't think it's that speculative. I think everything else we've been talking about is more speculative than this. I mean, I would say the dangers are very immediate. There's already been a significant level of scheming against him by the former ruling party, which frankly does not have a lot of support. So it's not clear what importance that has. There was a very interesting statement from the president, who was a sort of figurehead president of Armenia, who basically said, "I learned about this from the media. They should have talked about it more," really throwing Pashinyan under the bus in this. And there was, even before this, there was speculation, and there's been speculation going on about Pashinyan's future all along this war. One of the kind of key points of speculation was that this president, Armen Sarkisyan, could be the guy to take his place. And this statement certainly didn't do anything to quell those rumors. Today, I mean, I talked to protesters. It was a pretty small protest, but there were people in front of the parliament angry about this deal. And I kind of went there expecting that these were going to be maybe rent-a protesters from the old regime, or at least, opposition people. No, they turned out to be all Pashinyan fans. They all said, no, we were out there in 2018. We supported him. This is a betrayal of the revolution. And so I think that his standing is quite shaky. But the question of what happens as a result of that is absolutely anybody's guess. I mean, there's going to be an opposition rally tomorrow. But again, this opposition, which is pretty thoroughly discredited, so I don't expect that to amount to much. So, I mean, it's very early days, but I mean, this is, as a journalist, this is the number one question right now. That's the most immediate kind of consequence of this agreement is going to be the domestic politics of Armenia. Go ahead.
No, and I'm just wondering to get Julie's thought on this too, especially from the perspective as the first ruler that had not had a role in NK in the past. And in some ways it was a break from the past, but that was also his vulnerability. And now his government has presided over this sort of, distinct sort of loss. Do you see him any viable way forward for his government, Julie?
I think only in the sense that there's no obvious strengthened opposition. With Ter-Petrosyan, who is actually one, Nikol Pashinyan is one of his proteges. There was a gunner. There was someone obviously moving with this, with a movement to overtake Ter-Petrosyan, and for Pashinyan, that's not so clear. The politics of the dominant party in Armenia have been actually somewhat settled since that unstable time period, and so you have this power of the dominant party, which has become, part of the path dependency of how the Armenian government works, right? And now it's at odds with this failure in Nagorno-Karabakh. And so, we don't have crystal balls. We can speculate and hypothesize. We'll discover, I think, if there is a strong opposition actor to take over and redirect, Pashinyan's regime, I think it might be interesting. It probably will come from the inside as opposed to outside, maybe. And what that might do is provide an opportunity for kind of the movement of the Velvet Revolution to move forward without it being undermined by any kind of fall of Pashinyan. I'm also reminded, with me, everything is regional, and I think a lot about Georgia here. The pressures for Saakashvili after the Rose Revolution were very similar in this. In order to legitimize, one needed to fix the problem of corruption and also resolve the issue of the unresolved territories. And Pashinyan faced the same burden. What Saakashvili had as an advantage that Pashinyan didn't, is that there weren't spoilers, empowered spoilers inside in the Georgian political dynamic, where as for Pashinyan, he had no such advantage. And so I think in a way this was maybe a long fuse that was waiting for Pashinyan to stumble over, and one that anyone in his position, moving against the Republican Party, moving against the veterans group that kind of underpinned the Republican Party in Armenia, was going to stumble across.
Thanks for that. One of the really noticeable dimensions of this is the fact that Turkey has come in and appears to have coordinated a lot of its actions now with Russia, and that Turkey is a bona fide regional player. And when we put it in greater kind of geopolitical context, we see a kind of passing of the era. This might be one interpretation where, kind of the West and the immediate post-Cold War order, as was embodied in the Minsk group, seems to have just been crowded out of this in favor of the two regional powers reaching a kind of a condominium deal here. Josh, this also touches upon some of the questions here. One from Kate Loska, do you see any potential for the revitalization of multilateral efforts? And then I think also from Hiroyuki Shibuya, who wants to know about the possibility that the U.S. and Russia could work together in the region. I'm curious, do you see a kind of a geopolitical passing of the torch here, or do you think that the West and maybe a rejuvenated kind of Biden administration might pay some attention here and be involved?
Well, I can answer the last part most quickly. I'm pretty sure the U.S. is the ship has sailed in the Caucasus. As much as I don't want to be too cynical, but it's far away. Even before the Trump administration, there was a distinct move away, a very gradual disengagement of the U.S. After the kind of the heyday of the Bush administration. Obama had already sort of stepped back to a degree, and Trump obviously accelerated that quite a bit. This is clearly going to have massive geopolitical ramifications. I hesitate to predict what those are going to be. I think it's very early days. Obviously, Turkey's entrance is the most kind of significant geopolitical factor in this war. But it's interesting that in the agreement, Turkey's nowhere to be found. But this is all Russia. And there was a curious statement Ilham Aliyev said after this speech, after the agreement was signed, Turkey's going to be, participating in the peacekeeping. And then Turkey has issued a statement saying, we are not going to have anything to do with this. So it's very curious. It seems to me that Turkey's role is quite minimal. And that said, it's bigger than anybody else's other than Russia. So where this is all going, I think you're right to say that there was, I think in the early days of this conflict, it seemed people kind of thought that this was the proxy war, or that was sort of the kind of the rote geopolitical thinking that this is a proxy war with Russia on Armenia's side and Turkey on Azerbaijan's side. That clearly was not what was happening here. And whether it was an agreement or a condominium or what exactly were going on in the calls between Putin and Erdogan, we would all love to know. But it's true that this was not a proxy war by any stretch of the imagination. And certainly for Russia, it's more appealing to have Turkey here than to have the West, the quote unquote West. Turkey is somebody that I think they can deal with better, that they don't see as much of a threat as the West. And so I think for Turkey to be the second big player in the Caucasus is something that suits Russia.
Great. And then there's a few questions here, including one from Carol Sivets about Russia's role and deployment of Russian peacekeepers. And maybe start with you, Julie, and then turn it back to Josh for a final word. And in the context here about Moscow's ability to continue maintaining relations with Yerevan and Baku, and balance them now that it's going to have an active peacekeeping role? Is that going to put some strain on those kinds of bilateral tensions? Is there sort of a kind of a sweet spot here of, Russia needing just a little bit of instability to justify its role, but not a lot of instability to be able to show it doesn't have sufficient troops on the ground, and the fact that then it's having to pick sides and adjudicate issues that it probably really doesn't want to get involved in. So curious how you see the Russian angle from the kind of domestic inflection point, Julie.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it messing with bilateral relations, but I think it depends on how the power in those bilateral relations sit. Armenia is more reliant on Russia than the other way around. And so I think as long as Russia has the upper hand there, then it's not going to chafe so much at small bits of dissatisfaction among different actors on the ground over gas or oil or electricity or water rights or whatever the small issues are going to be. I think Azerbaijan's different because Azerbaijan is much more independent from Russia, especially economically. And so the imperial influence angle just works a lot differently there. And so I think I think already Russia's feeling that pressure from Azerbaijan. I think that's why a lot of the terms are happening the way they are. And I think that also Azerbaijan's relationship with Turkey pushes Russia into a much more activist role. I've seen a lot of disagreements online from experts about how to read the Russian intention here, whether this is something that is more kind of Moldova looking in the sense of maybe keeping things a little bit disruptive so that they can maintain influence, or whether it's understood as a way really to protect an ally with the Armenians on the ground in Karabakh. And different people have different interpretations, and I think it's something for us to watch going forward.
Josh, same to you, and any sort of final thoughts wrapping up here on this sort of sweet spot that the Russian peacekeeper is going to have to find politically.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I agree with what Julie said, and I don't know that I have that much more to say, except that I think that the key thing in Armenia is going to be what happens domestically and who's in charge, and that's going to determine very much of the future of Armenia-Russia relations. And so at this point, it's very difficult to say, but it's all going to proceed from the domestic developments here.
Great. So thanks so much. So we're at time. Thank you both for your insights and for joining us and responding to changing events on the ground. Thank you to the audience for also joining us and also for your excellent questions. Thank you to Eurasianet and their partnership here at the Harriman Institute. And what can we say? The world is changing. We'll continue to try and bring insightful, expert, cross-professional analysis. And on behalf of Harriman and Eurasianet, wishing everyone a good day, and we'll see you soon at another one of our events. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Justin. Bye.
Thanks for having me.